The ultrasound photo was still warm from her hand when Maren Caldwell saw her husband helping another pregnant woman out of his car. She had been standing just inside the sliding doors of St. Aldwyn's Hospital, tucking the little gray and white printout into the side pocket of her purse, smiling at it the way you smile at a secret you can't wait to give away. 6 weeks. She'd been feeling sick for days and had blamed it on the cold snap, on the stress at the firm, on the bad coffee in the break room. Adrian had told her that morning he couldn't do lunch, that a client wanted to meet downtown, and she'd kissed him at the door and told him to drive safe because the roads near the lake always iced over first. And now here he was. Not downtown. Here, in the curved drop-off lane outside the women's wing, in his charcoal wool coat she had picked out for him 2 Christmases ago, holding the elbow of a woman in a pale camel dress whose belly rounded her coat out in front of her. 7 months along, maybe 8. He guided her the way you guide someone precious, one hand at the small of her back, the other steadying her arm as she lowered herself toward the passenger seat. He said something. The woman laughed. He laughed too, easy and bright, a laugh Maren hadn't heard from him in months. The photo slipped out of her fingers and drifted to the polished floor. She didn't pick it up. She just stood there while the cold from the opening doors washed over her ankles, watching her husband close the car door gently, walk around the front, and drive away into the gray Toronto afternoon, as if he'd done nothing at all. For a long moment, Maren Caldwell could not remember how to breathe. She had met Adrian Voss 8 years earlier, in a stairwell of all places. She was 26 then, a junior associate at a midtown design firm, running late and carrying too many rolled-up drawings, and he was the man who caught the tube of blueprints before it could clatter down 2 flights of concrete steps. He'd grinned at her, handed it back, and said something about how the building's elevators were a crime against humanity. He worked 1 floor up, in commercial leasing. He came from nothing, he told her later. A small town outside Sudbury, a father who drank and left, a mother who cleaned other people's houses until her hands cracked. He'd put himself through school working overnight shifts at a distribution warehouse. Maren had grown up the other way entirely. The only daughter of a Rosedale family, her father a gentleman who called her his whole heart, and never once let her feel the weight of anything. She loved that Adrian had built himself from scratch. She loved that he didn't seem to want her money, only her. When her father, ever cautious, asked if she was sure, she had laughed and said she'd never been more sure of anything. They married in a tent on her parents' lawn under string lights, and Adrian cried during his vows, and she thought, this is a man who knows what it is to have nothing, so he will never take anything for granted. She had been so certain. The drive home from the hospital that day was a blur she would never quite reassemble. She remembered the wipers. She remembered a song on the radio she turned off halfway through. She remembered sitting in their driveway in Leaside for 40 minutes without going inside, because going inside meant the house was still the house, and she didn't know yet whether it was. When Adrian came home at 7, he kissed her cheek and complained about traffic, and said the client meeting ran long. Maren watched him take off his coat, the same coat. She watched him hang it on the hook by the door and ask what was for dinner, and she heard her own voice answer, flat and small, that she hadn't made anything. She told herself there would be an explanation. People are not always what a single afternoon makes them look like. She told herself this for 3 days while she didn't sleep and couldn't eat, while she stood in the upstairs bathroom each morning, gripping the edge of the sink, while a low cramp she didn't want to name settled into her lower back. On the 4th day she followed him. It was not difficult. He'd grown careless, the way people do when they've decided their wife is too trusting to ever look. She trailed his car at a distance she'd learned from no one, 3 vehicles back, all the way to a tidy semi-detached in the East End, with a wreath still up from a season ago. She watched him let himself in with his own key. She watched, through the front window, the camel coat woman cross the room and rest her head against his chest. And she watched Adrian Voss put both hands on that rounded belly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The cramp twisted then, hard, and Maren doubled over the steering wheel with a sound she didn't recognize as her own. She didn't remember calling 911. She remembered the dispatcher's voice, calm and Canadian polite, telling her to stay on the line, help was coming. She remembered the wet warmth and the terror of it. She remembered the paramedics' gloved hands and the gurney and the ceiling tiles of St. Aldwyn's sliding past for the 2nd time in a week. Except this time she was lying down, and this time there was no photo to keep warm. By the time they stabilized her, the baby was gone. There is a particular cruelty in a hospital room at 2 in the morning. In the hum of the monitors and the squeak of shoes in the hall, in being awake and alone with the worst thing that has ever happened to you. Maren lay on her side facing the window, watching snow come down sideways under the parking lot lights, and she did not cry, because crying felt like it belonged to someone who still had something left to lose. A nurse came in to check her vitals and said kindly, that there was a man in the waiting room asking after her. For one wild 6 second, Maren thought it was Adrian, and her whole body braced. But the nurse said the name, and it meant nothing to her, Julian Reyes. She told the nurse she didn't know any Julian Reyes. He came in anyway, hesitating at the threshold the way a person does when they know they have no right to the room. He was tall, dark-haired, maybe a few years older than her, in a good coat gone wrinkled from sitting too long in a plastic chair. He said he was sorry to intrude. He said he'd been the one in the parking garage when it happened. He'd been getting into his car and heard her, and he'd stayed on the phone with the dispatcher and ridden in the ambulance because she had been holding his hands so tightly, the paramedics assumed they were together, and he hadn't wanted to leave a stranger to wake up with no one at all. Maren looked at this man she had no memory of and felt nothing she could give him. She thanked him in a voice like a closed door. He nodded, understanding, and set a paper cup of tea on the rolling table. He'd noticed she hadn't touched the water, he said, and tea was better when the world had ended, and he left without asking her anything. She drank the tea after he was gone. She hated that it helped. Adrian came the next afternoon, when someone from the hospital finally reached him. He swept in full of horror and apology, his eyes wet, reaching for her hands, saying her name over and over. Maren, why didn't you call me? I would have been here, I would have come." And she had pulled her hands back and looked at this man she had loved for 8 years and asked him very quietly who the woman in the camel coat was. She watched the calculation flicker behind his eyes. She watched him decide, in real time, which version of the truth would cost him least. And then he did the thing she would never forgive. Worse than the affair, worse than the lie. He got angry. He said it wasn't what she thought. He said the woman, Sloane, was someone from work, that the pregnancy was complicated, that he'd been helping her through a rough time, and Maren was twisting it because she was emotional, because she was, and here he gestured at the hospital bed, at the worst data of her life, clearly not thinking straight. And then, when she just kept looking at him, he said the unforgivable thing, low and mean, that maybe if she'd told him she was pregnant instead of sneaking around to appointments behind his back, none of this would have happened. As if it were her fault. As if her silence had reached into her own body and done this. There was a chair beside the bed. A man Maren had never met was suddenly standing in front of it, between her and Adrian, and she realized it was Julian Reyes, who must have come back, who must have been in the hall. He didn't raise his voice. He just told Adrian that the patient needed rest and that he should go. And there was something so flatly immovable in the way he said it that Adrian, after a moment of bluster, snatched up his coat and went. At the door he turned. He looked from Julian to Maren, and his face curdled into something ugly. "Are you even sure that baby was mine?" he said. And then he was gone, and the door swung shut, and the words hung in the room like smoke. Maren did not see Julian Reyes leave. She only knew that at some point the chair was empty again, and the tea on the table had been refreshed. She filed for divorce 11 days later. She did not tell her parents the whole of it. She couldn't bear to watch her father's face when he learned what the man he'd doubted had done to his whole heart. So she told them only that she and Adrian had grown apart, that it was mutual, that she was fine. She moved out of the Leaside house into a small rented flat above a bakery in the West End, where the smell of bread came up through the floorboards every morning at 4, and she took the smallest, simplest version of the settlement her lawyer would allow, because she wanted nothing from Adrian Voss that she would ever have to look at again. Adrian fought it for a while. He came to the flat once late and stood outside ringing the buzzer, slurring apologies into the intercom, and she pressed her back to the door and did not answer. She heard him out there a long time. Eventually she heard him go. Winter became spring, became a kind of numb, functional summer. Maren went back to work because work was a place where her hands knew what to do, even when the rest of her didn't. She drew buildings. She presented to clients. She learned to construct a day out of small movements and get to the end of it. People at the firm said she'd become so focused, so driven, and they meant it as a compliment, and she let them. She did not expect to see Julian Reyes again. And then one morning in October, she was sitting across a glass conference table from him. Because her firm had been shortlisted to design the new community arts center on the waterfront, and the man funding it, the chair of the board, the founder of Thornadale Development, was the stranger who had held her hand in an ambulance and refilled her tea twice in the worst week of her life. He recognized her instantly. She saw it cross his face, a flicker, then a careful professional stillness, because he understood without being told that she would not want it brought up in a room full of her colleagues. He shook her hand like they'd never met and said he'd reviewed her portfolio and that her work on the Don Valley Pavilion was the most humane public building he'd seen in years. Her firm won the contract. Maren told herself it had nothing to do with him. She was assigned as lead on the project, which meant months of meetings, of site visits in hard hats, of arguing about whether the lobby should have wood or stone. Julian Reyes turned out to be nothing like she'd braced for. He didn't trade on the favor he'd done her. He never once mentioned the hospital. He just showed up to every meeting prepared, asked good questions, disagreed with her honestly when he thought she was wrong, and once, when a structural problem threatened to blow the budget, stayed until midnight with the engineering team eating cold takeout instead of leaving it to subordinates. She found herself, against every defense she'd built, beginning to trust the simple evidence of how a person behaved when they thought no one was keeping score. She learned his story in pieces. He'd built Thorndale from a single renovated warehouse into one of the largest developers in the country. But the money was newer than people assumed and the cost of it had been steep. His father had died when he was 19. His mother, Beatrice Reyes, had held the family together through those years by sheer will, and she had never quite let go of the steering wheel since. It was his mother who became the complication. Maren met Beatrice Reyes at a fundraising gala she'd been invited to as the project's architect. Beatrice was elegant and sharp-eyed and unmistakably the kind of woman who decided things. Within 10 minutes she had introduced Maren, pointedly, to a young woman at Julian's side, Camille Ashford, the daughter of an old family friend, polished and lovely, and draped on Julian's arm like the matter was already settled. Camille and Julian have known each other since they were children, Beatrice said, with the satisfied smile of a woman closing a deal. Both families have always hoped. Camille smiled too, and the smile did not reach her eyes when they landed on Maren. "You're the architect," she said. "How nice that Julian's giving local firms a chance." Maren went home that night and told herself it didn't matter, because Julian Reyes was a client and nothing more, and she was a divorced woman who had buried a child and had no business feeling the small, cold drop in her stomach she'd felt when she saw Camille's hand resting on his sleeve. But it kept happening. Camille started appearing at the site. She'd arrive with coffees for everyone and a particular sweetness aimed at Maren, the kind that's really a warning. "Mrs. Reyes is so excited about the wedding," she'd say. "We're thinking next spring." She made sure Maren heard it. She made sure Maren understood that whatever quiet thing was forming in the long late hours over blueprints, it had no future, because the future was already arranged. Maren said nothing. She kept her head down. She was very good by then at keeping her head down. What she didn't see was Julian's face during those visits, the way his jaw tightened, the way he'd cut Camille off, the way he told his mother, more than once and increasingly without patience, that he was a grown man and would choose his own life. Beatrice did not listen, because Beatrice had never once in her life lost an argument she'd decided to win. The thing that broke it open came from a direction none of them expected. Adrian's company collapsed that winter. Maren heard it secondhand, the way you hear about the weather in a place you used to live. A leasing firm overextended, a partner who'd cooked the books, lawsuits, insolvency. And she heard, too, that Sloan had left him. The baby, it turned out, had never been his at all. The woman had been carrying another man's child the whole time and had attached herself to Adrian for the soft landings his salary promised. And when the salary vanished, so did she. Maren felt nothing like triumph when she heard it. She felt a tired, distant pity, the way you feel watching a house you no longer live in catch fire. But Adrian, ruined and abandoned, did what ruined men do. He came looking for the thing he'd thrown away. He found her flat. She never knew how. A mutual acquaintance, probably, loosened by his pleading. He came up the stairs while she was carrying groceries in from the cold, and he was already in the open doorway before she understood what was happening. He looked terrible, thinner, his coat too big now, his eyes feverish. He said her name like a man dying of thirst. He said he'd been wrong about everything. He said Sloan had lied, that the baby was never his, that he'd lost the company and the house and everyone, and that the only true thing he'd ever had was Maren, and he wanted to come home. He stepped toward her. She stepped back. He kept coming. She told him to leave, and he didn't, and his desperation turned, the way it always had, into something with an edge. "It's because of him, isn't it, that Reyes, you think you're going to marry up?" And he caught her wrist when she reached for the phone. She would remember being afraid then in a clean animal way, her back against the kitchen counter, his grip too tight, his face too close. The groceries spilled across the floor between them. She didn't have to get free on her own in the end. There were footsteps on the stairs she hadn't heard over Adrian's voice. And then Julian was in the doorway. He'd come to drop off revised plans, that was all, a coincidence so small it would change everything. And he crossed the room in 3 strides and put himself between Maren and her ex-husband and told Adrian to take his hands off her. What happened after was brief. Adrian, humiliated and unhinged, swung first. Julian had grown up in warehouses and on construction sites and had not always been a man in a good coat, and it showed. He didn't lose his temper. He simply ended it, twisting Adrian's arm behind him and walking him backward out the door and down to the street, where he stood in the falling snow and told Adrian Voss that, if he ever came near Maren Caldwell again, the police would be the kindest thing he'd have to worry about. When Julian came back up the stairs, Maren was sitting on the kitchen floor among the spilled groceries with her arms around her knees, shaking. He didn't try to lift her up or fix it. He sat down on the cold linoleum beside her, close but not touching, and waited. And after a while, she never knew how long, she leaned sideways until her head rested against his shoulder, and for the first time since the hospital, in front of another human being, Maren Caldwell let herself cry. He didn't say it's all right, because it wasn't, and he seemed to know that. He just stayed. The bread smell came up through the floor, the snow came down outside, and something in her that had been clenched shut for a year began very slowly to unclench. The reckoning with Beatrice Reyes happened a month later, and Maren did not win it so much as simply refuse to disappear. Beatrice summoned her, there was no other word for it, to the Reyes house in Forest Hill, ostensibly to discuss the arts center, actually to deliver a warning. Over tea in a room full of pale furniture, Beatrice told Maren, with great politeness, that she understood Julian had developed a regard for her, that it was natural given the circumstances, but that Maren was a divorced woman with a complicated past, and that Julian's future had been planned for a long time, and that the kindest thing Maren could do for everyone would be to step back. Maren set down her cup. She was so tired of stepping back. She told Beatrice, with a steadiness that surprised them both, that she had no plans she was scheming toward, no ambitions on the family fortune, that she had buried a child in a marriage and built her own small life with her own 2 hands and asked nothing of anyone. She said she understood a mother wanting to protect her son, but she said that Julian Reyes was the only person in a very long time who had treated her like she was worth staying for, and that she was done being told her past made her less. If Julian chose Camille, Maren said, she would walk away and never make a sound about it. But it would be his choice, made by him, not arranged over teacups by anyone else. And then she stood up, thanked Beatrice for the tea, and left. She didn't know that Julian had been in the next room. He'd come home early and heard the whole thing through a door left ajar. He didn't know how to tell her, later, what it had done to him to hear her defend herself like that. Not by attacking, not by scheming, just by quietly refusing to be erased. So he didn't try to find the words. He drove to the bakery flat and climbed the stairs, and when she opened the door, he simply told her he wasn't going to marry Camille, that he'd never been going to marry Camille, that he'd told his mother so a dozen times and was finished saying it gently. He said he didn't know how to do this, he'd spent his whole life building things and almost nothing on letting himself want one, but that he wanted to try, with her, if she'd let him. Maren looked at this man standing in the cold stairwell with flour dust on his shoulders from brushing the doorframe, and she thought of a paper cup of tea on a rolling table at 2 a.m, set down by someone who had no reason to stay and stayed anyway. She let him in. Beatrice Reyes did not surrender easily, but she surrendered. It took most of a year, a slow thaw, a hard conversation Julian forced and would not let her escape, the gradual evidence of watching her son become a person she didn't entirely recognize, lighter, kinder, more himself. The breaking point came at Maren's father's birthday dinner, of all places where the 2 families met for the first time, and Beatrice watched the old Rosedale man take Julian's hand in both of his and thank him, voice cracking, for being good to his whole heart. Something in Beatrice's careful face came loose. After dinner, she found Maren alone by the window and said stiffly that she had been wrong, that she had judged a book by a chapter that wasn't even hers to read. She said she was sorry. And then, because she was Beatrice Reyes and could not help herself, she added that Maren should stop calling her Mrs. Reyes, that it was much too formal for family, and the word family hung there until Maren understood what was being offered, and her eyes stung, and she said, "All right," and didn't trust herself to say more. Maren and Julian married the following autumn, in a hall on the waterfront a stone's throw from the art center she'd designed, the building finished now and glowing through its tall windows in the dusk. It was not a small wedding. Thorndale's people made sure the city knew, but the part Maren would keep forever was small. It was the moment after the vows, when Julian lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, and she looked out at the lake, going gold under the last of the light, and felt, for the first time in years, that the future was not a thing to be survived but a thing to be walked into. As for Adrian Voss, he sent a letter to her father, of all people, months later, an apology, contrite and probably sincere, admitting everything, asking for nothing. Her father read it and quietly forgave him, the way good men do, and wrote back encouraging him to build an honest life this time. Adrian moved out west, to Calgary, to start over where no one knew his name. Maren never heard from him again, and the silence, when she finally noticed it, felt like a window opened in a stale room. She found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday in March, when the snow was finally going soft and dirty at the curbs, and you could smell the river starting to move under the ice. She'd been feeling off for days, tired, queasy, blaming the long hours, and a small cold fear had ridden along underneath, because the last time her body had done this it had ended in a hospital room at 2 a.m. She didn't tell Julian. She took herself to the appointment alone, the way she'd done it once before, and she sat in the waiting room gripping the arms of the chair. But Julian, it turned out, had noticed everything. The tiredness, the way she'd gone quiet, the appointment she'd kept from him. He'd learned, from a year of watching her flinch at sudden kindness, exactly how much she needed to do things her own way, and exactly when to refuse to let her do them alone. He was there in the waiting room when she came out, on his feet before she'd cleared the door. And the look on his face undid the careful thing she'd been holding together all morning. The doctor was an old friend of Julian's, a gruff man named Owen who pretended to resent being asked for favors and never once said no to one. He went over the results with a deliberately flat face that made Maren's heart drop straight through the floor, and then he turned the screen toward them both and let them see it themselves. Two, not one, two small flickering shapes, side by side, two heartbeats as fast bird wings. Maren put her hand over her mouth. Julian read the screen once, then again, and then he was laughing and crying at the same time, and he scooped her up out of the chair right there in the office and held her so tightly, she had to tell him to mind the babies. And he set her down and put both hands on her stomach, the way she'd once watched another man do for someone else. Except this was hers, this was real. This had been earned through every cold night and every closed door, and every time she'd stood her ground and refused to vanish. He turned to the waiting room, where strangers sat with magazines, and announced to all of them, beaming like a fool, that his wife was having twins. A few people looked up startled, then they smiled, the way people do. Owen muttered something about confidentiality and didn't mean it. And Maren Caldwell stood in the middle of all of it with her husband's hands on the life she had stopped believing she'd ever get to hold, and understood that the worst day of her life and the best one had happened in the same building, in the same kind of gray March light, and that somehow she had walked the whole long road between them on her own 2 feet. What had once felt like the end of everything had only ever been the place where the rest of it began.